They read the will under stained glass and fluorescent hum. My name never came up. Ellis Marwick, 57, former controller. I was seated near the coat rack, fingers wrapped around my father's old Waterman pen like it still meant something. Ever been erased by your own bloodline before dessert was served? I expected a reading of respect. Instead, I was erased in front of 50 relatives and a polished oak table. The ancestral house smelled of old varnish and dusted roses. A December draft slipped beneath the stained glass panes, rattling the lattice gently. I shifted in my seat, the one at the very end of the boardroom table closest to the hallway and farthest from the fireplace. No one told me to sit there. No one told me anything. Sutton sat near the head-tie loose tan from a recent golf trip. Lorraine didn't smile, she never did, but her cold nod across the table reminded me where we stood, me the forgotten. Her, the wife, still remembered. Lawyer Whitcomb adjusted his cufflinks, then unfolded a stack of papers from his briefcase. We are gathered today to honor the wishes of Mr. Thurston Marwick. His voice dipped slightly on my father's name, then returned to business. He read names. Sutton, beneficiary of the home and stocks. Lorraine, the gallery pieces and land. Several nonprofits would receive trust funds. Detailed amounts. Precise allocations. My name didn't come up. Not as a footnote. Not as a witness. Not even in whereas clauses. 50 faces watched me, some curious, some relieved, none surprised. Then came Sutton's hand on my back. Familiar. Patronizing. I'm sure Dad appreciated your help with the books, he murmured. I smiled faint and fixed, then stood. Is there a second document, I asked? Whitcomb blinked. He glanced at Lorraine, then Sutton, then shook his head slow and short. There is no codicil. No one else spoke. Just the groan of a chair leg against hardwood. Footsteps. Doors opening. They left like smoke dispersing graceful, silent cold. I lingered. My coffee had gone untouched. The porcelain cup sweated onto the coaster forgotten. Like me. Outside, the branches of the live oaks bowed under wind. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and closed my fingers around something metal. A pen. My father's old Waterman. The same one he'd used to correct my algebra homework, to sign my first apartment lease, to draw blueprints for a cabin he never finished. I hadn't planned to bring it. But it was with me now. And it was colder than I remembered. The wind shifted and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. The wind shifted, and the Spanish moss leaned closer to the window. I returned to the attic office. No one had touched since the funeral, except to clean out the bourbon. The stairs creaked louder than I remembered. It had been nearly a year. My knees stiffened with each step, and I used the railing like a man twice my age. The scent hit before I reached the landing, pine dust, old paper, and something fainter. Cedar oil, maybe, the kind he used to rub into the desk drawers. The attic hadn't changed. Same broken lamp slumped over the left corner. Same wall calendar from 2019 with the logging expo circled in red. A streak of winter light slipped through the skylight above and found the dust hanging motionless in the air. I closed the door behind me. The desk still had my old tax ledgers bound in green and labeled in my handwriting, PTA budget adjustments, HOA disbursement logs, deferred revenue, pending. I ran a hand across the top and came away gritty. Then I saw it. A red folder, wedged between the rolled blueprint tubes and a forgotten sandwich tin. Faded marker on the tab. Pending, Deck 2021. I pulled it gently and opened the clasp. Inside was a handwritten draft, not notarized, not witnessed, not even typed, just ink in his sharp cursive. It wasn't a formal will, but he had written my name E in the margin more than once. He used that when he was in a rush or when he was tired. There were edits, circles, arrows, whole passages scratched and rewritten. On the back of the last page in steadier hand he'd written, "A tree falls, but not its roots." No signature, but it was his. And it had been filed under pending, not discarded, not drafts. I sat back, letting the paper fall to my lap. The skylight above dimmed slightly as a cloud passed. Somewhere outside a truck shifted gears, then silence. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the Waterman. It felt heavier today. I uncapped it slowly. The brass tip caught the light just barely. I drew the pen to the bottom of the page near the notation, and without quite knowing why I wrote the date. December 7th, 2022. The ink bled slightly on the yellowed paper. I pressed too hard. My hand had trembled. Only after I finished did I notice the smear across the folder's edge, just enough ink to leave a mark, like something trying to take root. Outside wind pressed against the cedar shingles. 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 Aunt Callista didn't knock. She never did. I heard her before I saw her. The screen door creaked open, followed by a heavy step and the faint jingle of wind chimes. I turned around on the porch bench as she emerged holding a thermos and a linen napkin folded twice, once with care, once with resolve. She handed me the thermos first. Still hot, cinnamon and a little orange peel. For your nerves. Then the napkin. She didn't speak for a full minute as I stared at it. There, between faint coffee rings and dried smudges of jam, was a familiar loop of black ink. A single line. Accountability is a form of love. TM. I didn't need her to confirm it. I'd seen those letters carved into woodshop benches and ledger margins since I was 12. The same phrase was etched faint but deliberate into the brass collar of the waterman. I blinked once, then looked up. I found it under the bread box, she said, settling beside me. Her old cardigan smelled of laundry starch and fireplace smoke. He'd written it a while ago, I reckon. Napkins weren't his usual medium, but he never was predictable, was he? The wind rustled the ivy near the porch stairs. A dog barked 2 yards away, answered by another across the street. Inside, a gospel blues record creaked gently through the cottage walls. The thing about Thurston Callista said pouring tea into chipped enamel mugs, he hid truth in corners, not drawers. She handed me the mug with the Best Brother decal, faded but still visible. He told me late last fall he meant to rewrite the will. Said he didn't like the shape things were taking. Too much smiling from people who never visited him when it rained. She looked out at the yard. But he didn't do it, I asked. Callista shook her head slowly. He paused. Said Lorraine had urged restraint. You know how she gets when she thinks she's owed calm. I did. She sipped her tea. There was an envelope once, Christmas Eve. I remember because he brought pie and that envelope set both on my table. Said he'd mail it after dessert. But when he left no envelope... She paused again. What do you think was inside? I asked. Could have been instructions. Could have been guilt. I opened the napkin, fully careful with its brittle folds. The ink had run in places like he'd written it in a rush or while the paper was still damp. My fingers grazed the strokes, then instinctively reached into my coat. I traced the waterman again, pressing the brass edge with my thumb. Do you think he meant for me to find this? I asked. Callista tilted her head. I think he trusted you to know what mattered. Then she stood. From behind the screen door she returned with a small box. Cardboard. Plain. Taped shut with a strip of red packing tape that had started to curl at the corners. She set it in my lap. In Thurston's tidy print, one word stood out. Decisions. She didn't say another word. Wind stirred the ivy again. 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 They threw a gala for Sutton at the Timber Guild. I arrived 10 minutes early and still felt out of place. The hotel ballroom shimmered with a lacquered elegance, white linens, crystal sconces, and a jazz quartet tucked behind a row of fern palms, coaxing a sterilized sweet Georgia brown into the air. Everyone wore the right shade of confidence. My name tag was missing. A young staffer fumbled through plastic pouches before handing me a sticker that read, Ellis Marwick, guest. She didn't meet my eyes. I stuck it onto my lapel, just below the slight stain I hadn't noticed until then. Sutton took the stage like it was built for him. Spotlights softened the lines on his forehead, casting a gold shimmer on his cufflinks. Legacy, he began. Voice round and warm is not just inheritance. It's direction. It's daring. It's the courage to revise tradition. Polite laughter followed. He let the pause hang. I accept this honor not just for myself, but on behalf of those who shaped me. He glanced toward Lorraine, then swept his hand out. To the support staff who built us. Another round of applause. Shallow, uneven. I caught a waiter yawning into his sleeve. Lorraine's smile was camera-ready. Her pearl earrings twitched as she adjusted her angle for the photographer. When the flash came, it struck the side of her cheek and bounced into my eyes like judgment. No one mentioned me by name. At the side table, I lingered near the shrimp cocktail too long. 2 middle managers from Atlanta mistook me for Sutton's logistics coordinator. I let them. One offered me a drink ticket out of pity or protocol, I wasn't sure which. Near the dessert hour, a ceremonial card was passed around, cream cardstock mounted on polished mahogany. Sutton's signature arced confidently across the top, all loops and slashes. Lorraine's followed crisp and elegant. My hand reached for the Waterman almost without thinking. I uncapped it, pressed nib to paper, signed. Then it broke. Not a dramatic shatter, just a gentle, treacherous snap. The nib caught mid-letter and tore sideways, dragging a jagged line of ink through my name. I froze, watching the black trail bloom like a bruise across the cream. Someone behind me cleared their throat. Another coughed. I wiped my palm with the corner of a monogrammed napkin, careful not to leave stains on the sleeve. The pen went back into my pocket, heavier now somehow. I turned to leave, but Lorraine was there, lips pursed like a ribbon, not quite tied. Ellis, she said sweetly. Too sweetly. Don't take this personally. You were appreciated. We simply needed new energy. Her voice landed like the click of a closing file. Outside, night air clung to my collar. I stood alone on the steps, the low buzz of the gala muffled behind glass. The music floated out faintly hollow now, like it was missing notes. My phone buzzed. Callista. Horace Delaney's still alive. He remembers the real version. I didn't move. The ink on my hand had started to dry, flaking slightly at the creases of my knuckles. The pen had written its last letter, and still it felt like my name hadn't been signed at all. Horace Delaney slid a thick envelope across the desk. He said to give you this if they ever cut you out. His office, once a waiting room for the Charleston Southern Line, creaked with every shift in weight. The wooden floor sighed beneath our chairs. Lemon polish clung to the paneled walls, though the fireplace at the back sat cold and unused. I didn't read it. Horace added gaze steady, but mouth set thin. But he looked damn tired when he wrote it. I turned the envelope in my hands. It was thick, slightly yellowed, sealed with wax bearing the company crest, a pine over ledger lines. The seal cracked with a reluctant snap. The letter inside was handwritten. Not the terse block print my father reserved for business memos, but the uneven cursive I'd only seen on birthday cards and margins of blueprints. Ellis. If you're reading this, it means they've gone through with it. I didn't fight hard enough. I kept reading. My throat stayed dry. He explained the pressure. Lorraine insisted he keep the optics clean that Sutton would attract better investors. Sutton's firm handshake, his modern outlook, his ease with tech. I was tired, son. Too tired to push. I mailed the revised draft for notarization anyway. Then they told me it would complicate everything. He named names McKenna, Law, Baxter, and Klein, said they preferred the cleaner version, said he caved. My father, a man who once shut down a lumber mill over a single falsified invoice, now apologizing to me in ink and confession. I flipped the final page and found a photocopy tucked in. A notarized draft will, dated December 23rd, 2021. My name was in it clearly. So was the Pine Ledger Fund, and then across the top corner a thick black stroke, a crossout. Horace leaned forward, lips pressed together like someone who'd bitten down on something bitter. That mark wasn't his, he said. Lorraine delivered it. Told me there'd been changes. Asked me to destroy the older copies. I didn't. He walked to a tall cabinet and pulled out a leather-bound logbook, the kind with ruled lines and little tags on the edges for each year. She signed this, he said, flipping to a page. Delivery, Lorraine A. Marwick. Time, 9:43 a.m. Date, December 28th. I stared at her handwriting. It was unmistakable. Even her initials were decorative. She'd delivered the final version. I should have said something sooner. Horace muttered. But I wasn't ready to pick a side. The fireplace clicked softly. Not from fire, just the metal adjusting to cold. I reread the letter. One sentence etched itself deeper than the rest. The Pine Ledger Fund was always yours, not theirs. I folded the pages slowly, tucked them back into the envelope, slid the photocopy and logbook details into a separate folder. My hands trembled only slightly when I capped the Waterman and logged the date beside the new evidence. Horace cleared his throat. There's more if you want it. Notes from a meeting in early December. I kept the agenda. Outside, a train rumbled past, not stopping, just a ghost from a schedule long obsolete. I wasn't there to win anything, just to read my father's words out loud where they couldn't be buried again. The Charleston Civil Registrar Auditorium had the feel of an old church that had forgotten how to pray. Polished wood panels lined the walls. Ceiling fans turned with a slow, rhythmic hum. Rows of chairs faced the raised platform where two state notaries flanked the presiding judge. Gray suits filled the room. Beige suits outnumbered them. Callista sat behind me, a worn scarf twisted twice around her neck. Her expression stayed still. Beside her, Delaney held a red file folder. No flourish, just firm hands. Sutton stood near the aisle jaw, tight as a winch. Lorraine, 3 rows back, stared ahead with a poise practiced to perfection. She hadn't touched her water. I stepped forward and cleared my throat. The microphone whined once before yielding to silence. This letter, I said, lifting the sheet with my father's handwriting, was meant for me. But today I'm reading it for all of you. My voice didn't shake. My hands did, but only slightly. Ellis, I failed to act when I should have. That is my shame. If you're reading this, then someone took more than they were meant to. The Pine Ledger Fund is not theirs. It's yours. So is the duty. Fix what I left undone. I let the last sentence hang like sawdust in a shaft of light. A pause. Then Callista rose. She walked with care, unwrapping the envelope she'd kept sealed since December 2021. 2 witnesses. Both notarized, she said, handing it to the clerk. The notary examined the seal, then the signatures. She whispered something to the judge. Delaney stepped forward. "This version of the will predates the contested one," he said, "and it holds legal primacy due to its uninterrupted chain of custody." The judge leaned forward. "Is the original contested will on file?" "Yes," Delaney replied. "And it lacks a critical third verification." Another whisper. Another nod. The gavel struck wood. "The court recognizes the December 2021 will as valid. All subsequent versions are considered legally compromised." A long moment of silence followed. Delaney opened his folder and continued. "Per the verified document, the majority of Thurston Marwick's holdings, including full voting shares of Marwick Timber and the entirety of the Pine Ledger Fund, are hereby transferred to Ellis Marwick." No applause, just quiet. Sutton exhaled like a punched lung. Lorraine didn't move. Her water glass remained full untouched. The quote, the one from the napkin, echoed in my head. "Accountability is a form of love," I said aloud again. "That's what he wrote. That's what this is." I turned then, locking eyes with Lorraine. She didn't blink. "Do what you will," she whispered. He already did. And then she looked away. I had the choice now not just to accept it, but to carry it right. The Pine Ledger Foundation's main hall still smelled like sawdust and fresh paint. Sunlight sliced through the scaffolding, casting grid lines across the bare wooden floor. Workers called to each other from above, adjusting beams and panels, while the lower level echoed with light hammering. A folding table had been set up near the window on which sat the final revision of the Foundation's charter. I placed my father's Waterman pen beside it, restored, now its body stitched with a thin band of gold where it had once snapped. "You really fixed it," Callista said from the doorway. She wore her Sunday cardigan, though it was Friday, and held a paper bag filled with oranges and oat cookies. "Gold inlay," I replied, thumbing the pen's edge. Apparently some Japanese craftsman treats brokenness as part of an object's story. Callista smiled. "So did your father. He just didn't know how to say it." The young staff trickled in fresh out of college sleeves, rolled eyes bright with plans. They gathered in a half circle, giving the moment its due weight. I signed the final page. The ink flowed steady. Then I spoke. "My father always said pine wasn't fancy, but it held steady in storms. It grows slow, but it stays. That's what this place should be, about what holds." A few heads nodded. One young woman bit her lip like she was trying not to cry. We'd rehired 2 clerks Sutton had let go last year, one because she'd spoken up in a staff meeting, the other because he was too meticulous for Sutton's pace. They stood at the edge of the group now, awkward but welcome. From a side hallway, someone wheeled in a cart of new letterhead and cards branded with a fresh logo, a pine cone over stacked ledgers. Underneath a simple tagline, "Ledger, what matters?" I laughed quietly. They had a committee vote on that. "No," said one of the interns. We just liked how it sounded when you said it last week." Before I could reply, my phone buzzed. A single email. No sender, no subject, just one sentence. "You held the grain. He'd be proud." I closed the phone slowly, let it sit in my palm like something heavier than it should be, and for once I didn't need to ask who it came from. Opening day. Rain tapped lightly on the roof, but inside the lights were warm and every chair full. The Pine Ledger Training Center no longer smelled like sawdust. Now it smelled of fresh brewed coffee and new whiteboard markers. The warehouse-turned classroom held 50 chairs each occupied, and one small stage lined with a borrowed podium and a flickering projector. I wore no tie, just a pressed shirt and my father's watch. The Waterman stayed at home safe in its velvet cradle. Behind the podium I cleared my throat. "Finance," I began, "isn't about numbers. It's about not being forgotten." The audience, mostly young, some barely out of high school, looked up from their donated notebooks. I continued. "My father started the Pine Ledger Fund to help small logging families get loans to avoid the kind of squeeze that put his own father out of business. But he didn't tell many people that. He kept it quiet, just like he kept his own pain." The projector clicked to life, casting grainy photos across the wall, Thurston in overalls beside bundles of pine logs, ledger in hand. A few chuckled at the old typeface of his company's first invoice. One girl in the front row took a photo with her phone. I smiled, but didn't linger. Legacy isn't about control. It's about trust. As the talk wrapped up, a young man approached, maybe 19, shoulders, tight shoes, scuffed. "Sir," he said, voice a notch above whisper, "my uncle worked with your dad. Said you never made noise but always stayed late. Thought that meant something." I paused. My throat tightened. "It did," I replied. The rest of the day blurred tours, clipboard signatures, coffee refills. At some point, Callista slipped out the back, her scarf brushing the shoulder of a trainee as she passed. No goodbye. Just her way. Near dusk, I found myself in the courtyard behind the building. A pine sapling stood there now, ringed with fresh mulch. A ribbon was tied near its base, Thurston's first root. I knelt down, brushing damp soil from my cuff. Then I reached forward and touched the bark, soft, alive, unassuming. It didn't need to be loud. It just needed to grow. The sapling stood behind me now, catching late afternoon light, like it had always belonged. In my pocket, the Waterman pen lay warm, its gold inlay catching no one's eye but mine. We don't always get closure with a signature. Sometimes it's a quiet chair filled a silence broken with purpose. I used to think being left out meant I didn't matter. Turns out being underestimated gave me space to build something better. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's steady like roots growing beneath old soil. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Tell me your story in the comments or just sit with it a while. If it helps, you're not alone here.